Good day to you, and who in this class is an immigrant or a child of immigrant parents? I am. Britain, and most of you in this class are as well, which is not surprising, right? Because the United States by far hosts the biggest population of immigrants across the world. So that's what we're taking on today, not specifically the United States, but we are taking on immigration and the compatible term acculturation, which is adopting to and accommodating the new culture that you move to. We'll get to that in the back end of class today. So let's just make the point that humans have been migrating. It's not immigration, that's not emigration. We'll explain those momentarily. Humans have been migrating since they started leaving Africa, since we started having the ability to be mobile. We want to move around. That's what humans like to do. It's one of the hardest things that we're having to cope with in this pandemic is the ability, without the ability to move around. So migration, the movement of people, has been taking place really since the beginning of being human beings. And as nation states started to form and boundaries started to be erected in the form of borders, then we start to have that kind of migration being seen as potentially problematic. The people who establish certain outposts, colonies, countries, regions, not wanting their traditions and customs to be changed by new people. So a lot of countries, not just the United States, a lot of countries have erected walls, fences. There's a barbed wire fence going up in India right now. Fences, walls, borders. This is how some countries, including the United States, as you well know, has had conversations about how to quote unquote control immigration. Let's define some terms, though, now so that we know exactly what immigration is about and the differences between different kinds of immigration. Let's just say, first of all, that a person who goes to another country is not an immigrant if they're visiting that country. That makes them a tourist. If they're there for a couple weeks, 3 weeks, they're a tourist. The next kind of person, I've been in this category, is a sojourner. This is a person who goes to spend extensive periods of time in another country, but they intend on returning to their home country. So I was a sojourner in England a few times when my parents lived there during the summers, and also in Sweden a couple summers, and I'm currently a sojourner in Mexico because my wife and I have a second house in Mazatlan, Mexico, and we try to spend as much time there as we can. We can't do it right now because of the pandemic. So let's compare those terms to an emigrant. A person who's an emigrant is leaving a country to go somewhere else. You're emigrating from a country. Whereas a person who's an immigrant is you are immigrating to a country. You're coming into a country. Another term that's commonly used is expatriate. That's somebody who leaves a country and takes up residency or citizenship in another country, and they still consider themselves to be closely aligned with the mother country, but they are living in another country. Examples of that would be somebody living in South Africa who originated from England. England has had a lot of emigration from England to South Africa and vice versa as well, but somebody living in South Africa who's English and still maintains those ties are going to be an expat. Let's compare those kinds of immigrating peoples to refugees. Refugees are people who are leaving a country because it's unsafe. It's unsafe because of starvation in the country or natural disaster or war or disease. So they're seeking refuge in another country. They can't continue to live in the country they're in. It's too dangerous to them. An asylum seeker, an asylee is another way to put it, is seeking residency in another place because of political reasons. They are making the case that they are being persecuted. Like Julian Assange. He was holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy for the alleged raping of two Swedish women. The charges were eventually dismissed, but he left his own country, the United States, and Sweden as well, to take up residency in the Ecuadorian embassy as an asylum seeker because the United States was also seeking to prosecute him for releasing classified information. That's an asylum seeker. Now let's focus in on immigration more specifically as that term that stands out amongst all of them because it has that feeling of coming into where you are living. And let's just say across the world that about 3.3% of the world's population is living outside of the country of those people's births. So it's not that many people out of 100%. 3.3 is not that much, but in terms of sheer volume of people, it's massive. The countries that have the most emigration leaving from those countries are India is number one, Mexico's number 2, China's number 3, and Russia is number 4. Now, as we said earlier, the United States hosts the most immigrants in the entire world. Most people are coming to the United States, followed by Germany, and then Russia. And you'll find that some of the concerns that lead to immigration in a positive sense are countries fearful of their population declining. And that is the case of Germany. Population declining. So they need to keep the population at a certain number in order to be able to have the workers necessary to provide the current population with the services and needs and education. And so some countries, they welcome immigration because their population is declining, and particularly in areas of work where they need workers. So that's Germany's case as well. But on the other side of the equation, a lot of concern is expressed about immigration when it has to do with national identity. What is the national identity going to be if it starts to be changed radically? That's a threat to a lot of people. And then we have also the jobs question. And the argument is on both sides of this equation as well. Some people say, the immigrants, they're performing jobs that the others would not want to do. If you go to ESU, there's quite a few custodians who have emigrated from other countries. They're performing jobs, quote unquote, that other Americans don't want to do. The same as in cooking industries and construction industries and agriculture on the farms. So immigrants are very sorely needed, some people say. Others, on the other side of the equation, say no. Immigrants are taking American jobs. They are taking away jobs Americans would otherwise fill. So there's a lot of tension that goes on when discussing issues of immigration. And some countries have gone to a point system, like the United States, scoring points on education and on income and on whether you have a job. Those are big points in the U.S. approval process for immigration. But it's not easy to get into the United States today, even before the Trump administration, which is publicly scaled down immigration efforts. For example, students next semester cannot study from foreign countries, cannot study at American universities if those universities are only online in the fall. They're not able to get the visas to come into the country. That just came down a couple days ago, that decision. And then, of course, you know about the border wall that's often being talked about by President Trump. But even prior to that, immigration was driven by needs of people seeking a better life. And that's probably the case for many of you in this class. Just people, not necessarily refugees, asylum seekers, are just seeking a better life. And I have been at the border of Mexico and the United States when I was researching my book, Comparing Media from Around the World. I was brought to Mexico as a guest speaker and a workshop holder by the U.S. consulate and also by the U.S. Embassy. The embassy was in Mexico City, but the consulate was in Juarez City, which is on the border of El Paso in Texas and Mexico, and Juarez City is on the other side. And I went through an immigration center, and I saw a room full of people patiently waiting all day long, Mexicans seeking to get into the United States. That was the first time that they were able to have a hearing in 10 years. That is to say that they had been waiting 10 years to have the possibility to go to the United States. And many of them were coming in on work visas, and they had to prove that they had a job to return to in Mexico and that they had family and friends, that they would not come to the United States and then go AWOL. And it was just amazing to me to see the desire on the part of Mexican people to come to the United States. Of course, that was before the Trump presidency. Let's move on to some specific countries and highlight their immigration history, very different and interesting immigration histories. We're going to talk about Israel first. Israel gained its independence only in 1948. Prior to 1948, Israelis did not have a country, so it was formed in 1948 after World War II, the country of Israel. Prior to that, it was a place that was mostly known as a poverty area of the world, but it has since changed that through its immigration policies. Today, in fact, only 43% of Jewish people live in Israel. The rest of the people live in other places in the world, including New York City. New York City has 1.1 million Jewish people. It's the biggest Jewish population outside of Israel. Now, Israel has tried to populate itself by enacting what would be considered to be very lenient immigration laws, immigration from other countries back to Israel. For example, they have the law of return in Israel. The law of return allows for immigration and citizenship. And there's a religious term that's used from Hebrew called aliyah, and that's ascending into Israel. And the Israeli government will even pay for you, if you are Jewish, to go back to visit Israel, and you're allowed to immigrate into Israel if you are Jewish, which is if you have a Jewish mother or if you have converted to Judaism. So there's that policy, which has repopulated Israel, or populated it for the first time from Jews that had otherwise been living in other parts of the world. And then there's a certain subgroup of Jewish people, Ethiopian Jews, going back to biblical literature, and they're from a region of Ethiopia called Falash Mura, and they were provided a pathway to come to Israel, escaping a life in Ethiopia, which was very difficult and hard because it's so hard to grow things and to feed the population in Ethiopia. 93,000 Ethiopians have immigrated to Israel, and there's a lot of conflict about Ethiopian Jews being acculturated into the Israeli population. There's different problems about in racial conflict. There's problems about the jobs that they have, the educational opportunities, many of the same problems that we face here in the United States. So, and then there's also a big section of Russian Jews in Israel. And most of the Jews from other countries in Israel are actually of Russian heritage. There's 1.2 million Russian Jews, and a lot of the Russian Jews that came into the country came in by marriage, which is to say some of the Russians were not Jewish themselves, but they were married to Jewish people, and other Russian people came to Israel just because of economic opportunity. Now let's move to the region of the world, Europe. Europe, a very interesting region. The EU, or European Union, was founded in 1993. I was over there when it was founded. It was brought together, and basically what that tried to do is develop a semi-loose confederation of states. It's difficult to decide whether it's a federation or a confederation, depending on how strong the central power is versus the individual states. But it formed in 1993 with the idea that there was going to be passport-free movement across Europe, so no borders. And I remember going through Europe at that time, and prior to the EU, you'd have to go to a checkpoint, and Germany was very different from France, and Belgium was very different from Germany, etc. Every country you'd have to stop and go through the customs line and show your passport. That all went away with the formation of the EU. Of course, we know that Britain has exited the EU. That's what Brexit was all about. Now, the immigration policies in Europe are not the same in every country. You do find differences, but probably the biggest challenge that people would say, and I even found the book somewhat biased in this respect, is talking about Muslim immigration as being a problem in Europe. And certainly it has been a challenge for the Muslim immigration because Muslim culture and language is so different from many European cultures and languages. Most of the Muslims are coming from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, although they have also come from Morocco and Algeria. So you take a country like Holland, which is been known as one of the most tolerant countries in the world to other peoples. I mean, it had to be. It's a small country. It's dependent upon sailing. Amsterdam, one of my favorite cities in the world, just is the most incredible city when it comes to multiculturalism. I rode my motorcycle from England to Amsterdam, and I was trying to find the campsite that I was going to, and I pulled up to a lady. She was probably in her 50s, walking on the sidewalk, and before I could ask her a question, two other people approached her. They asked her questions. The first one asked her a question in German, which she answered. The second one asked her a question in French, which she answered in French, and then I asked her my questions in English about the campsite, and she answered in English. And I don't know, maybe she was a professor, maybe she was a language specialist, a translator, I don't know, but she looked to me like an average citizen, and she's speaking all these languages, and Amsterdam is very tolerant in and of itself. So even Holland, which used to have a very liberal policy of accommodating new peoples, abandoned its policy of multiculturalism, and now it requires people who move to that country to learn Dutch. So these are some of the ways that countries have responded to the immigration, much of it fearful of Muslim immigrations. Nordic countries, the Swedens, etc., they also have difficulties. I've been in Sweden when there have been several incidents with immigrants, primarily from Syria, who are in these enclaves. They are not mixing with other parts of the population. It's a problem with Swedish policy, and they have a higher rate of crime. And when they go to the hospital, they have different traditions. My Swedish friend, who's a nurse, said that she was treating some people from, I think she said she said they were from Syria. It might have been Lebanon, but the woman threw herself on the floor when she received the news of her medical diagnosis and was flailing. And that's a different kind of cultural expression than Swedes are used to, or normally reserved people. So there's all kinds of conflicts about accommodating new peoples and the way that people behave who come into a country. So that wraps up Europe. Now let's go on to refugees. Let's talk about refugees. We want to focus in on them. These are asylum seekers. Probably the greatest source of refugees in the last 5 years has been Syria, which has been enveloped in a civil war between different factions, different religious factions, and a lot of Syrian refugees are seeking asylum elsewhere, including here in the United States. Germany has taken on a lot of refugees from Turkey, from Syria. There's a long tradition of Turkish labor being used in Germany, but Germany has been very accommodating in part because it needs workers, because it needs to keep its population high. Sweden, I mentioned earlier, has historically been one of the most accommodating countries for refugees. Sweden is known as a caring and kind society, but as I mentioned earlier, Sweden is struggling as well. And Britain, even though it's an island away from the rest of the world, actually has one of the most diversified populations. There's a long tradition of Britain going around the world, right, for when it had its colonial empire and controlled 25% of the world, including Australia, the United States, Jamaica, lots of places, Singapore. And so with that connection there, a lot of people from those colonies emigrated into Britain. It actually has a fairly diversified population. All right, now let's go on to talk about other countries. We're going to focus on Brazil here. Brazil has a history as a melting pot, like the United States, of different races and cultures. Brazil's a monstrous country. It's just slightly smaller than the United States. The official language there is Portuguese. It was colonized by Portugal, and for a time afterwards, Portugal did not let people from other countries immigrate to Brazil. They only wanted Portuguese people immigrating to Brazil. And that solidified the Portuguese base and the Portuguese heritage and Portuguese language as at the root of Brazilian culture. Portugal has had the highest count of slavery, another very large immigrant population. For example, in the United States, at its peak, there were 400,000 slaves. In Brazil, 4 million. 4 million slaves, and not only that, but Brazil was the last country to abolish slave labor. It was the very last country to do that in 1888. Now, there were 3 waves of immigration that came to Brazil. The first wave was Europeans in the 1800s to replace that labor that had been taken away by abolishing slavery. And after the Civil War, in the same time period, actually a lot of people from the South, to escape living under a northern rule, the Confederacy, they went to Brazil. And there are cultural traditions of people celebrating the Confederacy in Brazil today. Then there was a second wave. A second wave came from Europe in 1904 to 1930. It was a lot of Japanese immigrants who were working on coffee plantations in Brazil and in other sectors of the agriculture. So again, a lot of immigration that's welcome is due to supplying a labor force. And then the third wave, there was a second round of Japanese people as well immigrating to Brazil. In addition, Brazil has received asylum seekers from Angola, Africa, Sierra Leone, and Afghanistan. Now let's hit close to home. Let's talk about the United States. The United States has 20% of the world's immigrant population. 1/5 of the world's immigrants live in the United States. 46 million immigrants. It's a lot of immigrants. And we've had a history of immigration. We've had a history of immigration because our country was one of the newest countries. And when I start to say this, I almost start to say, what is immigration? I mean, immigration is just people moving. I mean, every country has undergone immigration anytime you have people moving. But in terms of a formal process, the United States has had different stages. So Massachusetts, for example, they wanted settlers who were religiously pure, who were Puritans. So they recruited immigrants of that nature. Virginia and Maryland, they recruited immigrants for cheap labor, but those immigrants did not have voting rights. Pennsylvania, I'm pleased to say, welcomed all European settlers, unfortunately didn't include the rest of the world, but on equal terms, and gave them equal participation in the political process here in the Commonwealth. And the Pennsylvania model eventually became the model for other states for immigration during this time period. There were some laws that were passed along the way that also influenced U.S. immigration policy. In 1798, there was an Act Concerning Aliens law. Act Concerning Aliens law, which gave the president the power to deport immigrants deemed too dangerous. That law is still in play today. And then in 1868, the 14th Amendment was established. It was not established for immigration, but what it said was you have a birthright if you have a birthright to citizenship in the United States, meaning if you're born here, even if your parents have come here illegally, you are eligible to be a U.S. citizen, and that opened up immigration. A lot of parents, I have Mexican friends, they wanted a better life for their son or daughter. They came to the United States to have their son or daughter born here. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it is a fact. In 1875, there were federal laws that were enacted that are limiting immigration and barring convicts and prostitution. And then in 1921, Congress for the first time established country quotas for how many people could come from different countries. Let's see if I can get rid of the sun here. I'm not sure if that's a little bit better. So yeah, that law established quotas, and that's how my parents got into the United States. They were coming from a region of the world. I'm just going to move over here actually. There, that's better. So that's how my parents got into the country, from the quota laws, because Britain was looked at very favorably compared to other countries. Middle Eastern countries, for example, the quotas are much lower. So we've had different waves of immigration. The largest wave of immigration was constituted by slavery. 10 million slaves at one point, and as a side commentary, and a sober commentary, 12 million left Africa. So 2 million lives were lost. But 10 million people of African American and Caribbean American heritage make up that largest block of immigration into the United States. Other areas where we've had waves of immigration into the United States include Western Europe. A lot of these people came through Ellis Island, not too far from here in New York City. It's an immigration processing place where many Italians had their names changed and the spellings of their names because the people who were coming in were not literate. They couldn't spell their own names, so the people at Ellis Island, when they process them, and you ought to go there sometime. It's a great historical tour to see how immigrants were treated and what it was like for them to come to this country with just a suitcase full of their belongings. And their names were changed at Ellis Island, and it processed a lot of people. In fact, about 35 to 40% of people today can trace a family member back to coming through Ellis Island. Each wave of immigration in our country brought a new kind of prejudice. Prejudices towards Irish people or drunken brawlers, towards Italian people or swarthy people. These were the stereotypes that were developed, and it continues on today for immigrants from the Caribbean, from Mexico, from Central and South America, about the stereotypes of people, drug cartels, as for example. So those waves of prejudice had to be overcome for people to be acculturated into this country. Today, the largest immigration is coming from Mexico, and you know about the kinds of imagery that's created about Mexicans coming into the country. Now let's move on to discussing some of the effects of immigration. We're going to talk about immigration and individual identity, and Alvin Toffler wrote the book Culture Shock, and he talked about what it's like for an immigrant to go take up residence in another country. And there are 4 stages, according to Toffler. And the first stage is this initial euphoria, initial contact and initial euphoria. You come into a country, you're saying, oh, look how cheap it is here. Look how big of a lawn I can have here. Look at the car that I can have. Look at the education. Everything is great. That stage is usually followed by a second stage, which is a disintegration of family cues. So the family's traditions, my father, for example, he grew up in a household where there was no talking at the dinner table. I don't know why, but he was Scottish, so that's the way he tried to raise us. And we just started as kids. There were three of us eating at other friends' houses, and they didn't have to not talk at the dinner table. So why couldn't we? So we started talking. He had to give up. He probably didn't even know why there was no talking to begin with. It's just how he was raised. So these kinds of family cues start to dissipate. And then you have a reintegration of new cues into the family. Like, again, to cite my family, soda was never part of my mother or father's background. And all of a sudden you have a kid bringing a soda into the house, and it's a new way of living that you have to either accept or fight. And then it creates the problems in the family. And eventually you reach the fourth stage, which is gradual adjustment. And along the way, immigrants go through a lot of problems, the physical problems. They start to focus on cleanliness of food and making sure that what they're eating is absolutely clean, cleanliness in the house. And then physically they experience insomnia and anxiety and overthought process. So this happens. But then there's also reverse culture shock. My parents experienced that a few times because they moved to the U.S., back to England, back to the U.S., back to England, back to the U.S., and then back to England for their final stay there. My mom's back in the U.S. Moving back to the original home country, there's a reverse culture shock that takes place because now you have a big part of the new country in you. So now let's take on the concept of acculturation. Acculturation is where an immigrant group becomes assimilated to and accommodates the new culture. They become part of that culture. And Young Kim, a researcher in this area, has a cross-cultural adaptation theory where he says that it really depends on whether the host culture has competence to communicate the symbols and the meaning systems of the host culture to the immigrant culture. Do you have education programs to provide language instruction? Do you have education programs to provide learning the laws and if you have a constitution in your country? Do you have programs to accommodate people who are needing medical care that have different values and aspirations and have different experiences with seeking medical care in other countries? For example, if you go for medical care in Holland, you walk into the hospital, there's no paperwork. You see a doctor. You're sick, you see a doctor. You worry about the paperwork afterwards. Very different from our culture with all these privacy statements. So that has to be addressed. And that's one of the first elements of cross-cultural adaptation theory. Secondly, you have participation in host social communication. And that means, is the group that's entering the country, are they able to participate in the mass media and the interpersonal communication that goes on? Of course they do on social media, but are they participating just with people who have emigrated, or mostly with people who have emigrated from their region, or are they communicating with other people in the rest of the population? Certainly the potential is there with social media today, and certainly many immigrant families take that up and make new bonds and forge new ties, but it's really about whether that host country provides those opportunities. And then there's participation in ethnic social communication. This communicating with fellow co-immigrants so that you can understand. It's kind of like belonging to, maybe this is a crude comparison, but Alcoholics Anonymous or widower groups, where you meet with other people who have faced same challenges or similar challenges that you face so that you can help each other through those circumstances. And then we have another element which is called the host environment. And that is the strength of the immigrant group to be able to maintain its culture in the new environment, but not at the same time give up on learning the new culture. So that's why you have a Chinatown. That's why you have a big Turkish section in Paterson, New Jersey. That's why you have a big Russian contingent in some of the developments in the Poconos here, and a Polish contingent. That's why you have Latino radio stations to bring communities together. That's why you have African American celebrations of Kwanzaa to bring together cultures from the original emigrating countries. And that's the fourth plank to Kim's cross-cultural adaptation theory. The last one is to predisposition to immigrants from other countries. In the United States, there's a bias towards immigrants coming from some kind of, generally speaking, the United States public opinion would say it's more favorable towards immigrants from Western Europe than to immigrants from Central and South America, for example. Now let's go on to the effects of media and transportation advances in this country. Original immigrants, when they came here, they were subjugated to writing letters if they wanted to communicate with people from the homeland, and the letters would be on boats. It would take 3 months sometimes. And so that's not the story today with the internet, with email and the web and all the different social media platforms and the apps on your phone. The potential there is for the new culture coming in, the newer culture coming into the established culture to acculturate, to gain the value system and be okay with it in the new country and adapt to it. So let's finish now with categories of acculturation. You can think about where your own family is at right now if you do have immigrants in the family. And in terms of the process of acculturation, the first step is marginalization. That's where you lose your cultural identity and you no longer have contact with the larger society. So you go into a country, you feel isolated because you're the only one from Trinidad, you're the only one from Congo that you know, you're the only one from Alabama that you know in wherever you're living, and at the same time you're not assimilating, so you're isolated. You're isolated from your background heritage, you're isolated from the new country you're going into. It's one of the most lonely and alienating experiences that you could go through. And if that's not that's one category. A second category is separation that maintains one's original culture and not participating in the new country. So separation is where you are maintaining your culture because there's perhaps enough people who are living in your area from that other culture. Maybe they're Chinese, maybe they're Korean, maybe they're Ecuadorian, maybe they're Costa Rican, maybe they're Puerto Rican, big Puerto Rican communities, but not necessarily participating as much as should be done in the new country. So there are isolated pockets of cultures that are existing in the larger culture. A third category is assimilation. Assimilation is where you give up one's culture and you move into full participation. You give up your religious practices. If you used to celebrate Day of the Dead, you no longer do that anymore. If you used to wear bright scarves, you no longer do that anymore. If you used to practice a religion in a worship place of your choice, you're no longer doing that. You've given yourself over to that new culture's assimilation. And then there's integration, another category. Integration is where you maintain important parts of your original culture, the food, diet, values, but you're also becoming part of the new culture. That one is the ideal, right? Where you're able to hang on to your heritage. I still have lots of stuff in my house that reminds me of my Scottish heritage. I've got my Mackenzie clan. I don't like the word clan with the potential meaning in today's subject, but the Scottish clan was a very different thing. It was by your last name. So I have Mackenzie clan. I drink my tea. I don't